What does "lest we forget" mean in 2025? The generation that fought in the Second World War is passing away. Fewer Canadians today personally know people who fought in modern conflicts. Michael Petru is working to make sure their experiences will live on. He's a historian at the Canadian War Museum, and I talked to him about the In Their Own Voices project, which features reflections from those who've served. Michael, great to have you on the program. How are you doing today?
Good, Jan. Thank you for having me.
I want to start off with your family connection. You grew up with a family connection to Canada's military. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. I mean, the most direct one that I had when I was a little boy was my mother's father, William Newberry, who served in the Canadian Army. He was a lieutenant and officer, fought through Sicily, Italy, Northwest Europe. Was with the Ontario Regiment with the tanks, and it fascinated me as a young boy. But like so many veterans, he rarely talked about it. So there was this gap between what he'd experienced and what clearly meant a lot to him. There was scattered artifacts around his house from the Second World War. He carried a silver dollar in his wallet that had been given to him by his high school teacher when he enlisted, and he kept that on him every day for his entire life. It was on his person the day he died. So clearly, the Second World War mattered to him. It had shaped even the many years that followed. But but it wasn't something that he talked about a lot. And I think that's quite common with a lot of veterans of the Second World War and veterans of other conflicts and other periods of service as well.
I can imagine, you have your personal connection there. You work at the Canadian War Museum. I want to have a better understanding of, do you think most Canadians today feel a personal connection to our military and its history?
Well, certainly less now, I think, than after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we look at the post-service experiences of veterans, I think that's a really important distinction. I think it's been fascinating in the course of my work here. I've interviewed more than 200 veterans and their family members, and it's been fascinating to see some of the shared experiences of veterans of the Second World War and veterans of more recent deployments. The comradeship, often the grief, the having experienced something that many people who have not been in the military can understand. So there's that shared experience. But a big difference between the Second World War and today, when you asked about the personal connections, I think yes, I mean, many Canadians do have a personal connection to the military, but it's less than it was after the Second World War.
Hmm.
After the Second World War, 1 million men and women were veterans. So when they came home, they were surrounded by people that had been part of the war effort, who had a common understanding in many cases. That's different now for, say, veterans of Afghanistan, about 40,000 served. And I think certainly there's still the same bonds of comradeship, but with larger society, I think there might be a little bit of isolation, a little bit of a gap, a big gap, I think, between the veterans' experience and what the broader society understands. And I think that can be lonely. I've spoken to veterans, who talk about when they get together, that's when the real stories come through in a kind of trusted, safe space amongst people who have a common shared background. But another veteran told me once he lives here in Ottawa, and he says, I live in a city that's I'm surrounded by 1 million people, and none of them know what I what
Hmm.
I did, and I think that can be a little bit lonely. So even though there is that personal connection, I think it's less than it has been at other times in our history, and I think that matters. I think that's impactful for veterans.
Well, let's talk about that connection in their own voices, the project. Tell me how it came to be in sort of the stories that you are capturing in those.
So the goal of the project, that was the the idea, the inspiration, was my recently passed colleague Tim Cook here at the museum, and his goal and our goal was to better understand the ripples of a conflict, the ripples of service, the ripples of war, and how an experience in the military, wartime, yes, but also peacetime deployments, peacekeeping, once that period of deployment ends, once that conflict ends, we wanted to better understand how those ripples continue to shape the lives of veterans and even their families in the years and decades and sometimes generations afterwards. So the premise was a lot of military histories end when the war ends or the deployment ends, but the impacts continue. The war is not over. The period of service is not over in the minds and in the hearts of people who were there. And so we wanted to dig into that uncover that sometimes hidden history, that hidden or underexplored aspect of military service.
What does the archive tell us about how Canadian society was shaped by our military history?
That's, I think, a really important point. And war and military service, it shapes veterans. It
Mhm.
shapes their families, but through them, it also shapes their communities and indeed Canada itself. So I think sometimes we have a tendency to think of wars or deployments as discrete events, as isolated events, but they're not. Even 80 years after the Second World War, Canada is still very much, we are a country that was shaped in many ways, that is shaped in many ways by the Second World War. So the veterans experience, military service, has had an enormous impact on Canada, on the role of different people, different groups in Canadian society. To look at the Second World War specifically, we can look at the experiences, say, of women. The role of women in society changed radically because of the service of women during the war and filling roles that were not open to women before, a certain liberation socially in terms of work. That was a direct impact of the Second World War. For certain marginalized communities, Asian Canadians, Chinese and Japanese Canadians served without having enjoyed the full rights of citizenship. Now, when they came back from the war, to be able to say, look, we had served, we were willing to die, was a persuasive argument in terms of the struggle, the post-war struggle for greater political and civic equality. Similarly, we look at the experience of Indigenous veterans who many enjoyed a greater equality while serving in the Second World War amongst their non-Indigenous colleagues, and then came back to a society where they did not enjoy the same sort of support and welcome and equality as their non-Indigenous comrades. And yet their experience in the war was really a galvanizing one in terms of nurturing or inspiring or pressing uh, a new generation of post-war Indigenous leaders who were shaped by their experiences in the Second World War. So all these ripples impacted Canadian society as well, not far
Hmm.
beyond the war, all aspects of Canada. So I think that's an important point, is that the military history does ripple through peacetime and civil society too.
All right, with that, we actually have a clip from the archive that we want to show. This is from a veteran who served in the Royal Canadian Navy in World War II. Here he is describing what it was like when the war ended.
What am I going to do for the rest of my life? I wasn't trained for anything. I wasn't trained to go to university. Just, I was shook up. When you're on a gun like that and it maybe fire 50 rounds in a battle, it does something to you. I don't care what anybody will tell you. You're just not strong enough to handle it.
All right, listening to that, why is it important for us in 2025 to hear what veterans and families have to say, even though, as you mentioned, there is that distance in time from the last time that we went into war?
Well, I think we need to put ourselves in the place of that veteran. That's Alex Paulowin, who's since passed, and he was one of the first Second World War veterans that I interviewed. And I'll always remember that moment. I had asked him, "How did you feel when the war ended?" And his response was, "I was scared." And that has always that bored into me at the time, and it stuck with me since. He described coming into Halifax, and for the first time, the boats were lit up. You weren't worried about dying anymore. But he was scared because he was facing this chasm of years, indeed decades in front of him with no idea what to do. And that was overwhelming. And it's important to get that perspective. It's important to understand that it wasn't just celebration and uplifting. It was this jarring, disjointing moment for many people. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? And that scared Alex. In addition to the some of the symptoms and the impacts of combat, which he talks about being shook up, is how he phrased it. You'll find Second World War veterans may use different vocabularies than younger veterans, but they're describing similar symptoms. So in addition to that, there's this kind of more existential, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? So, imagine yourself at 22. Imagine having experienced this enormously consequential event, and then imagine coming home and wondering what comes next, and imagine what that does to you inside. you can't get that, I don't think, unless you're hearing it directly from somebody like Alex, which I think is what makes interviews like that quite special.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jan.